In the sprawling expanse of America's deep south, where the horizon seemed endless and the humid air clung to every breath, cotton was king. Dubbed white gold, this crop fueled an economy that generated staggering wealth. By 1860, the Mississippi Delta alone had produced more millionaires per capita than any other region in the United States. But this wealth was not born of innovation or progress. It was carved into human flesh, stitched together with blood and sweat, and harvested through a system of relentless torture disguised as labor. The cotton fields were less fields of prosperity than open-air prisons, where life itself became a grueling sentence. At the first hint of dawn, long before the sun's rays reached the soil, enslaved men, women, and children were already on the move. Solomon Northup, whose harrowing account, 12 Years a Slave, remains one of the most vivid testaments to this world, described it simply. The day begins with the first dim streak of dawn and ends when the darkness sets in. On some plantations, like the notorious Woodland Estate in Louisiana, dawn's arrival was not marked by light, but by violence. Overseer John Bones was infamous for firing his pistol into the pre-dawn air at 4 o'clock sharp, a sound that sent terror rippling through the quarters. That pistol shot was not just a call to work, it was the sound of despair, announcing another day in a life of unbroken servitude. The labor demanded was not just endless, it was deliberately destructive. As Frederick Law Olmsted observed during his travels through the South in the 1850s, enslaved workers were driven into the fields at daybreak and were kept there until it was too dark to see. Even then, some plantations imposed the so-called lantern rule, forcing laborers to continue picking by the dim glow of oil lamps. Sleep was rationed more cruelly than food, and the body was treated not as flesh and blood, but as a tool to be pushed until it broke. Picking cotton itself was a brutal ritual. The fluffy boll, so deceptively soft to the eye, was imprisoned within sharp husks that tore into skin with every handful. Workers developed techniques to move quickly, both hands plucking at once, fingers wrapped in scraps of cloth. But even the most experienced picker ended each day with hands shredded and bleeding. Mary Reynolds, who survived the fields and shared her testimony during the 1930s Federal Writers' Project, recalled, "When you're picking cotton, you're fighting the plant itself. Every handful is a battle, and your hands carry the scars of every war." On the Butler plantation in Georgia, the daily quota stood at an impossible 150 to 200 pounds per person. Meeting that standard often meant choosing between sleep and punishment, because falling short meant the whip. If the fields were merciless, the southern summer itself was the cruelest overseer of all. In Mississippi, Georgia, and Alabama, temperatures soared well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees Celsius, while humidity turned each breath into a struggle. Heat stroke and dehydration claimed lives with terrifying regularity, yet overseers kept the pace unchanged. A Louisiana plantation owner's diary from 1845 reads with chilling detachment, "Lost 2 field hands to the heat today. Production must continue." At Alabama's Forks of Cypress plantation, enslaved workers were forced to wear heavy clothing even in the most suffocating heat, allegedly to keep sweat from staining the cotton. In practice, it was a death sentence. Local physicians documented multiple deaths from heat exhaustion each season, the bodies of the fallen quickly replaced by new captives brought in from auction blocks. Even water, the most basic element of survival, became a weapon of control. Charles Ball, in his 1837 memoir, Slavery in the United States, recalled overseers pouring fresh water onto the parched ground in front of desperate workers, forcing them to watch it vanish into the dirt. Access was carefully rationed. At South Carolina's Whitehall plantation, overseer Thomas Thistlewood placed single water barrels at quarter-mile intervals, making workers march long distances in the blistering sun for a sip. Many were forced to drink from stagnant pools, teeming with bacteria. Illness was inevitable, but suffering was part of the design. To thirst, to ache, to weaken, these were not accidents, but instruments of domination. Food was no less a tool of cruelty. Weekly rations often consisted of a few pounds of cornmeal, a bit of salt pork, and occasionally molasses. On Oak Alley Plantation in Louisiana, 1 week's allotment was 5 pounds of cornmeal, 2 pounds of pork, and a pint of molasses. Barely enough to sustain a single adult, let alone one working from dawn to dusk. Some owners embraced what they called the least cost feeding program, giving just enough to keep the enslaved alive, but not enough for true health. A physician's report from 1850 revealed that enslaved plantation workers consumed fewer calories on average than prisoners of war a century later. Harriet Jacobs, in her narrative Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, recalled, "The best food was reserved for the white family. The slaves received the scraps, and sometimes not even that. Malnutrition spread like a poison. Pellagra, scurvy, and rickets were common, slowly wasting bodies already broken by labor. Children were born small, their growth stunted, their futures predetermined." Dr. Samuel Cartwright, despite his racist and pseudoscientific views, acknowledged in his journals that deficiency diseases were rampant among plantation populations. Disease thrived in the cramped, squalid quarters where dozens of people were forced to share a single space. At the Evergreen Plantation in Louisiana, the Black House crammed up to 20 individuals into a room barely 200 square feet, the perfect breeding ground for epidemics. The quarters reeked of sweat, sickness, and hopelessness, but to the planter class they were simply part of the machinery of production. Even the cotton itself was a weapon. Its dust filled the lungs of those forced to harvest it, producing chronic respiratory illness. Dr. J. Marion Sims, infamous for his unethical experiments on enslaved women, nevertheless documented the rise of cotton consumption, a disease akin to slow suffocation unique to plantation workers. Cuts left by the plant's sharp husks became infected in the humid southern climate, festering into wounds that rarely healed. These were not accidents, they were features of a system that calculated profit down to the last drop of human blood. This daily crucible was not designed simply to wring labor from bodies, it was designed to break the spirit. Frederick Douglass captured it with piercing clarity. The system was designed to transform the slave into a thing, to make him like a brute beast. Overseers maintained control not only with the whip, but with exhaustion, hunger, thirst, and fear, a precise science of dehumanization. On Dockery Plantation in Mississippi, the sundown rule dictated that anyone who fell short of their quota worked through the night by lantern light, no matter how broken their body. In this way, time itself became a weapon, each day a repetition of cruelty, each night too short to heal. By 1860, Southern cotton exports exceeded $190 million annually, billions in today's dollars. That wealth was built on backs bent beneath the sun, on fingers bloodied by thorns, on lives consumed by quotas. William Wells Brown, an escaped slave turned abolitionist, described it with brutal precision. The cotton field is where souls are broken, where hope goes to die. And yet, within that crucible of torment, survival itself became an act of defiance. Every cotton boll picked, every dawn endured, every night survived was a silent declaration. We are human, we endure, we resist. Engines of cruelty, whips, brands, and iron restraints. If the fields broke the body through unrelenting toil, the punishment system on cotton plantations was designed to do something even darker, to break the will. Enslavement was not just about labor, it was about terror. Overseers and masters built a complex architecture of cruelty, a ritual of pain that sought to make resistance unthinkable and survival itself an act of submission. It was not punishment in the sense of justice, it was punishment as spectacle, as warning, as a language of absolute control. The whip was the instrument most synonymous with slavery. Not merely a strap of leather, but often a carefully crafted device of torment, the whip existed in variations designed for maximum suffering. The dreaded cat-o'-nine-tails, braided ropes or leather thongs tipped with knots, tore open flesh with each strike. Solomon Northup described the sound as blood-chilling, cutting the air and falling on the flesh so that the victim leaped involuntarily. At Louisiana's Myrtle's plantation, overseer James Ryder made a ritual of soaking his whip in salt water, a grotesque method to both disinfect and intensify the agony of every lash. Former slave Henry Bibb once wrote that the crack of the whip, mingled with the screams of the beaten, was the music of the South. Punishments were calculated with mathematical precision, cotton quotas were deliberately set beyond human reach, and each pound missed could translate into lashes. Overseers turned pain into arithmetic. At the Smithfield plantation in Virginia, overseer Thomas Jefferson Green maintained a punishment ledger that linked shortfalls in cotton directly to lash counts. 2 lashes for every pound under quota, he recorded, a grim equation he called a certainty of correction. Workers were often forced to count the lashes aloud as they were delivered, each number a public reminder to the community of the price of failure. This was not random cruelty. It was ritualized, codified, and systematic. But whippings were only the beginning. For those who attempted escape or resisted in any form, punishments grew grotesquely inventive. On Georgia's Whitehall plantation, records describe the routine cropping of ears for those caught planning escape. In a single month of 1842, the plantation ledger documented 37 such mutilations. Branding was equally common. Heated irons pressed into flesh left permanent scars of ownership, sometimes initials, sometimes symbols. The letter R marked a runaway. On Belmont Plantation in Mississippi, enslaver James H. Hammond favored his own initial H as a mark of property and shame. These were not punishments meant to heal. They were punishments meant to mark, to humiliate, and to remind every eye that dared to look upon the branded that resistance carried a lifelong scar. The iron collar was among the most feared devices, sometimes simple and heavy, other times engineered with spikes pointing inward. These collars were designed to inflict constant pain and prevent rest. Any movement of the head pressed the spikes into skin. Overseer diaries record how some collars were left on for weeks, festering with infection, scarring necks for life. Archaeologists at Oak Alley Plantation unearthed variants with small bells attached, making every movement ring out, transforming human beings into both captives and instruments of their own surveillance. The sound of those bells announced presence, betrayed hiding places, and ensured the enslaved could never forget the weight upon their necks. There were even machines built for punishment. At Tennessee's Wessington Plantation, a device known as the whipping machine was used to deliver lashes with mechanical precision. Devised by Joseph Washington in the 1840s, it employed pulleys and weights to regulate the strength and number of blows, turning the whip into an instrument of industrial efficiency. The sheer invention of such a device testifies to the cold ingenuity invested in maximizing pain without necessarily reducing productivity. The punishment sheds of plantations often resembled medieval torture chambers more than barns. Iron masks, thumb screws, shackles, and ankle chains filled their inventories. A ledger from Belmont Plantation in 1857 read like a catalogue of cruelty, devices chosen not merely to punish, but to terrorize. The cruelty extended into deliberate maiming. Hobbling was the name given to the breaking or crippling of legs to prevent escape. Some overseers preferred severing the Achilles tendon, ensuring that the enslaved could still work in the fields but never run again. Dr. J. Marion Sims, remembered for his unethical medical experiments, noted in his journals that overseers sometimes preferred this method because it allowed a quicker return to labor. Here was the grotesque balance: break the body just enough to prevent freedom, but not enough to reduce profitability. Dogs, too, became instruments of horror, Pierce Butler of Georgia maintained packs of Cuban bloodhounds trained specifically to hunt human beings. Former slave Moses Roper described them with dread. The dogs are trained to catch a man, but not to kill him unless he struggles. At Mississippi's Belmont Plantation, a pack of 50 such hounds was valued more highly than dozens of enslaved men and women. Their howling at night carried the sound of death itself, a living terror that echoed across the fields and quarters. Punishments were often staged as public theater. Executions were not swift, they were orchestrated as spectacles meant to sear fear into every watching eye. In Missouri, the case of Celia, a young woman executed in 1855 for resisting her enslaver's sexual violence, demonstrated the deadly consequences of defiance. At Louisiana's Evergreen Plantation, overseers maintained a correction ground where executions were carried out with ceremony, often on Sundays before compulsory church services. In Natchez, Mississippi, gallows were erected near the slave market itself, their presence a visual reminder of the price of rebellion. Pain was not hidden, it was put on display. Humiliation was often woven into these punishments. On Louisiana's Angola Plantation, overseer James H. Thompson required those beaten to recite a gratitude prayer, thanking him for correction. At Laurel Valley Plantation, the wounded were forced to kneel in front of the overseer's home at nightfall, regardless of injury. At times, enslaved people were made to clean the blood of others from whipping posts or even participate in punishing family members. Olaudah Equiano, in his memoir, recalled, "The degradation was designed to destroy not just the body, but the soul." Religion itself was co-opted into this system of terror. Overseers and owners cited scripture as justification for brutality. Reverend Thornton Stringfellow's 1856 sermon, "Slavery's Divine Sanction," circulated widely in the South and was often quoted during or after punishments. Some plantations went so far as to build punishment chapels, where whippings were followed immediately by prayer services, forcing the enslaved to sing hymns while their backs still bled. Frederick Douglass captured the hypocrisy with devastating clarity. "Between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. Perhaps most insidious of all was the unpredictability. Punishment could be arbitrary." At Louisiana's Whitney Plantation, overseer J.P. Benjamin reportedly rolled dice each morning to decide who would be whipped, regardless of their behavior. On Mississippi's Riverside Plantation, the Sunrise Lottery consigned workers to random punishment, ensuring that fear was ever present. As Harriet Jacobs remembered, the mere sound of approaching footsteps could trigger panic, never knowing if it was the moment of wrath. This constant uncertainty bred a terror that reached beyond the whip's crack. It lived inside the mind, a permanent companion. And yet, even amidst this architecture of cruelty, resistance simmered. The escape of Robert Smalls, who stole a Confederate ship to freedom, or the 1811 German coast uprising led by Charles Deslandes, these moments testified to the refusal of some to accept total domination. Harriet Tubman herself, who declared, "I had reasoned this out in my mind. There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other," stood as living proof that the human spirit, though battered, could not be fully extinguished. The implements of torture, the whips, collars, brands, and iron masks, now rest in museums, their metal cold and silent. But their legacy is not confined to glass cases. The system that created them left scars deeper than skin, resonating across generations. As historian David Blight once wrote, the sophistication of plantation punishment was not merely about controlling bodies, it was about breaking minds in ways that echo through generations. Every mark, every scream, every prayer uttered in pain lingers in history's memory, a warning and a call never to forget. Harvest of death, sickness, starvation, and neglect. Death was no stranger to the cotton plantations. It lurked in the fields, in the cabins, in the very air itself. Where cotton promised wealth, it also promised slow ruin to the bodies that harvested it. Disease, neglect, and the absence of care made every day a gamble with mortality. The enslaved lived not only under the lash, but under a constant shadow where a small cut, a fever, or a cough could mark the beginning of the end. The cotton plant itself inflicted wounds that could kill. Its thorny boles cut into hands thousands of times a day, leaving skin shredded and raw. These cuts, trivial in another life, became death sentences in the hot and humid South. Infections spread quickly in bodies already starved of nutrition. At Mississippi's Dockery Plantation, overseer records clinically described what they called cotton blood poisoning, infections that began as a scratch and ended as death. Sarah Ashley, recalling her mother's fate, said, "It started green, then black, and in 3 days, she was gone." At Louisiana's Frogmore Plantation, medical logs recorded that nearly a third of worker deaths stemmed from such infections, small wounds magnified by neglect into mortal threats. The broader landscape was rife with killers. Malaria thrived in the swampy lowlands of Georgia and South Carolina, claiming lives every summer. Overseer Thomas Hamilton at Evergreen Plantation once recorded, "Lost 15 to fever this week, ordered remaining hands to work double to keep production." Yellow fever, nicknamed Yellow Jack, struck with devastating speed. In the epidemic of 1855, Greenwood Plantation lost 78 lives in a single month. The owner, James Humphreys, coldly calculated in a letter to his broker, "The dead are easier to replace than the crop." Tuberculosis, known then as consumption, swept through the overcrowded quarters where dozens of people slept in airless rooms. Dr. Josiah Knott's records from Alabama revealed infection rates of up to 40% among enslaved populations. At Louisiana's Belle Grove Plantation, one winter alone saw 23 die of the disease, their coughs echoing through the cabins like a nightly chorus of suffering. Quarters meant for livestock were often more ventilated than those in which humans were forced to sleep. Even those who endured the fields were never safe from exhaustion. Heat stroke and dehydration killed without ceremony. Overseer James McCarthy of Louisiana's Parange Plantation noted one summer in 1847, 3 dropped today before noon, replaced them by sundown. To the planters, lives were as replaceable as broken tools. Magnolia Plantation's death records used a chilling euphemism, expired in field, as if the body collapsing under the sun were merely another crop harvested. For enslaved women, pregnancy brought unique torments. At Tennessee's Wessington Plantation, pregnant women were still expected to pick up to 200 pounds of cotton a day until labor began. Mary Reynolds recounted watching a woman give birth between the rows. She caught her baby, bit off the cord, wrapped it in her skirt, and kept picking. At Andrew Jackson's Hermitage Plantation, overseers boasted of women returning to the fields within an hour of childbirth. The toll was catastrophic. At Virginia's Smithfield Plantation, nearly 60% of infants died before their first birthday. Harriet Jacobs described how the cries of newborns and mourning mothers formed a constant duet of despair. Children were ravaged by disease and neglect. Dysentery, known as the flowing sickness, killed with merciless speed. At South Carolina's Boone Hall Plantation, one outbreak in 1849 claimed 27 children in 2 weeks. A physician, Dr. Toby Green, wrote, "The children waste away before our eyes, their bodies unable to retain even water." At Louisiana's Destrehan Plantation, overseer Philippe Leblanc's death book recorded that nearly half of all child deaths came from flux, dysentery, or similar intestinal afflictions. In cabins where a single bucket of stagnant water served for drinking and washing, sanitation was non-existent. Cholera and skin infections thrived. Medical care, when it existed, was a cruelty in itself. Plantation doctors often experimented on enslaved bodies as though they were specimens. At Oak Alley, logs describe using bloodletting for fevers and hot tar for open wounds. Barclay Plantations records mention forced turpentine and mercury treatments. Dr. J. Marion Sims, later hailed as the father of modern gynecology, built his reputation through surgeries performed without anesthesia on enslaved women like Anarcha, who endured 30 procedures, while Sims justified his barbarity with racist pseudoscience. The myth that black people did not feel pain as whites did underpinned this medical exploitation, a belief that sanctioned unthinkable violations. Psychological suffering compounded physical pain. Overseer Thomas Davidson at Laurel Valley described cases of what he called ghost sickness, workers rendered catatonic after witnessing brutal deaths. Modern medicine would call it trauma, depression, or PTSD, but in the fields, it was simply another form of collapse. Solomon Northup wrote, "The sound of death became as common as the singing of birds." At Evergreen Plantation, a woman named Lucy Thurston secretly carved a tally of deaths into her cabin wall, a hidden memorial to those lost, discovered only generations later. Even hygiene was denied. At Drake Plantation in 1845, inventory records showed a single bar of soap allotted per 20 workers each month. At Melrose Plantation, a shared water bucket spread cholera and skin infections like wildfire. Cotton dust filled lungs, producing what physicians termed cotton pneumonia, coating airways until suffocation became inevitable. Dr. William Hull described it as lungs plastered over from the inside. Disease and death were not accidents, they were embedded in the very structure of plantation life. The cruelty extended into economics. Some plantation ledgers coldly compared the costs of treatment against the costs of replacement. At Whitehall, entries weighed whether to pay for care or purchase new captives. Angola Plantation maintained a replacement fund for workers expected to die each season. John Burnside of Humus House summed it up with chilling simplicity. "It's cheaper to buy than to heal." The enslaved were not seen as people, but as investments to be maximized until they broke. Yet even amidst this devastation, survival strategies emerged. Enslaved healers passed down herbal remedies in secret, guarding knowledge that white doctors dismissed. At Magnolia Plantation, an elderly woman known as Old Sarah cultivated a hidden medicinal garden that saved countless lives. Songs carried coded information. At Hampton Plantation, specific verses identified plants with healing properties. On Butler Island, mysterious markings in slave cabins may have been instructions for treating common ailments. These hidden practices formed a parallel system of care born of necessity and resistance. The human body was ground down, broken, and consumed in the machinery of cotton. Life expectancy in some plantations was as low as 7 years from the first day in the fields. Charles Ball, reflecting on his years in bondage, wrote, "Death was often a mercy, a release from a life of unending torment. The planters measured lives not in years, but in output. A life well spent was one that produced until collapse, a life replaceable at auction. And yet, each act of survival, each healed wound, each child saved, each whispered song of resistance became an act of defiance. Even in a world where death was constant, the will to live refused to die." Run for freedom, pursuit, capture, and retribution. To flee the cotton fields was to gamble one's life against a system built to make escape impossible. The geography of the South, swamps, rivers, thick forests, and open cotton plains became both shield and snare. For the enslaved, freedom shimmered like a distant horizon, a dream glimpsed but rarely reached. Every attempted escape was an act of breathtaking courage, but also a declaration of war against a machinery designed to hunt, torture, and destroy those who dared to defy it. Fog rolling across the fields concealed more than landscape. It concealed hope, footsteps, and desperation. In the bayous of Louisiana, the marshlands of the Carolinas, or the tangled swamps of Georgia, enslaved men and women risked everything to run. Frederick Douglass once confessed, "I have often wished myself a beast, I preferred the condition of the meanest reptile to my own. Anything, no matter what, to get rid of thinking. The yearning for freedom burned so fiercely that even the near certainty of capture did not extinguish it. But escape routes were laced with danger. Slave catchers, often professionals employed full-time, patrolled like hunters of human game. Patty Cannon's gang, operating along the Maryland-Delaware border, was infamous for intercepting fugitives. They maintained what came to be known as cannon crosses, choke points where escape routes converged, turning desperate flights into deadly ambushes. In Mississippi, the Duncan brothers boasted of their ability to track a runaway by scent alone, keeping gruesome collections of captured fugitives' belongings as trophies. Overseers armed themselves with one of the most terrifying weapons of all, dogs. Specially bred Cuban bloodhounds were trained to track human beings with precision. William Wells Brown wrote of them, "They can follow the scent of a man more surely than that of a fox or deer." At Georgia's Millwood Plantation, Overseer Thomas Thistlewood meticulously recorded his use of such dogs, setting them loose into swamps to flush out fugitives. At Mississippi's Belmont Plantation, a pack of 50 bloodhounds represented a greater financial investment than many enslaved workers. Their baying at night was enough to send shudders through the quarters, the voice of death on 4 legs. The very environment was weaponized. At South Carolina's Singleton Plantation, overseers engineered what they called constraint corridors, shaping the landscape to funnel escapees into ambushes. Butler Island Plantation deliberately flooded lowlands to create watery prisons. Magnolia Plantation established a dead man's mile, a cleared strip around its perimeter where no cover existed, ensuring that anyone crossing it would be exposed to mounted patrols. Moses Grandy described how some fugitives carried red pepper in their pockets to confuse the hounds. But even this small act of defiance became torture itself when sweat and swamp water mingled with pepper in open wounds, burning like fire. Capture brought horrors equal to or greater than the escape itself. At Butler Plantation, a runaway named William was subjected to 3 days of ritual torture, salt rubbed into lash wounds, starvation, and finally confinement in a suspended iron cage left to bake under the sun. Sarah, a young woman recaptured at Mississippi's Waverly Plantation, had her feet deliberately broken and reset incorrectly, leaving her permanently crippled. Overseer records chillingly referred to such acts as reminders. Some overseers developed signature punishments, turning cruelty into a kind of branding. The Gory family of Texas specialized in tracking fugitives and devised methods of mutilation that marked captives with scars, ensuring their disobedience was forever visible. The cold, bureaucratic tone belied the horrific violence. Iron masks, spiked collars, and chains were often employed on recaptured fugitives. French traveler C.C. Robin, visiting Louisiana in 1803, described seeing escapees forced to wear iron face masks fitted with inward spikes. The ingenuity of cruelty here surpasses imagination. The sight of a fugitive in such restraints, paraded before others, served as living propaganda of hopelessness. Collective uprisings inspired punishments of unimaginable severity. Denmark Vesey's planned rebellion of 1822 in Charleston led to 35 executions and laws banning black assemblies. The Natchez Rebellion of 1729 resulted in reprisals so brutal that one historian noted, "The Mississippi River ran red with blood for 3 days." On plantations like Edwin Epps's, even unfounded rumors of plots led overseers to inflict random terror, ensuring that fear poisoned solidarity. Psychological warfare was as pervasive as physical punishment. At South Carolina's Rivers Bridge Plantation, James Hammond devised a graduated privilege system that rewarded informants with better clothing, rations, and housing. Trust within the quarters rotted. Charles Ball lamented, "Trust died among us like leaves in autumn. Each morning you wondered which friend had become an overseer's ear." At Oak Alley, those who informed on others were housed in comfort cabins, creating visible divisions that eroded communal resistance. Even successful escapes were precarious. Anthony Burns's 1854 flight to Boston ended with federal troops and $40,000 spent to return him, a staggering cost equal to millions today. William and Ellen Craft's audacious escape, disguised as master and servant, succeeded but left them in constant fear, pursued even in free states by slave catchers empowered under the Fugitive Slave Act. Harriet Tubman, who freed hundreds, once said, "I could have freed 1,000 more if only they knew they were slaves." Her words captured the suffocating atmosphere of terror that made even the thought of escape feel futile to many. The odds were grim. Records from Rivervale Plantation in 1855 listed 27 documented escape attempts, 12 of which ended with bodies never recovered, logged coldly as lost property, presumed deceased. The Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society kept what they called the Dark Ledger, chronicling failed attempts, each entry a shadow of a life lost. William Still, secretary of the Underground Railroad, lamented, "For every Moses we help across the Jordan, 3 sink beneath its waters." Angola Plantation in Louisiana, later transformed into one of the most notorious prisons in America, pioneered techniques of pursuit that resembled military operations. Overseer Samuel James developed circular pursuit, dispatching mounted patrols outward in concentric rings, while signal fires coordinated movement. Captured fugitives were often placed in iron masks so cruel that a WPA interviewee in 1937 recalled, "It wasn't just iron, it was pure evil made solid. You could hear them screaming through the metal like dying birds." Yet, even in this nightmare, communities of resistance emerged. Along the coasts, Gullah Geechee communities preserved African traditions and created networks of communication. Songs disguised as spirituals carried coded instructions. Wade in the water directed fugitives to travel through streams to throw off dogs. Other hymns mapped safe houses and routes. At St. Helena Island's Penn Center, archaeologists later uncovered hidden meeting places where strategies for escape were planned. As historian Joseph E. Holloway noted, "Every song was a map, every prayer a plan." The economics of hunting human beings were calculated with the same cold precision as labor quotas. Belmont Plantation's 1851 ledger contained an entry under security investments that read, "Purchase of Cuban hounds, $900. Estimated prevention of 6 escapes. Value retained, $4,800. Return on investment, 533%. Torture was not only terror, it was profit, designed to keep the human machinery intact and obedient. Some plantations became infamous for their brutality. Dockery Plantation's example yard was used for public tortures of captured runaways, often attended by enslaved people from neighboring estates. One WPA survivor recalled, "Even the trees at Dockery seemed to weep blood." At Virginia's Randolph Plantation, psychological torment was refined. Recaptured fugitives were forced to serve as overseers' personal attendants, compelled to enforce the very system they had tried to escape. The legacy of these hunts stretched far beyond emancipation. The tactics of slave patrols evolved directly into Southern law enforcement. Bloodhounds remained in use to track prisoners well into the 20th century. Angola Prison, standing on the same soil as the plantation of its name, became a living reminder that systems of control mutate but do not vanish. And yet, for all the odds, for all the dogs and guns, for all the iron masks and broken bodies, escape attempts never ceased. The will to run, to risk death rather than submit to bondage, burned brighter than the terror designed to extinguish it. As historian Vincent Harding wrote, "The river of struggle in Black history has never been calm." Each fugitive, whether they vanished into swamps, were dragged back in chains, or reached freedom against all odds, contributed to a current of resistance that would one day swell into a flood. The enslaved were hunted like animals, but their flight was not animal instinct. It was profoundly human, a cry for liberty so powerful that even the most sophisticated machinery of terror could not silence it forever. Echoes of defiance, survival, memory, and the human spirit. The cotton plantations of the American South were more than fields of labor. They were factories of terror, laboratories of cruelty, and theaters of human endurance. Generation after generation was ground through this machinery, producing wealth for some and despair for many more. Yet within that darkness, sparks of defiance, resilience, and dignity endured, fragile lights that refused to be extinguished. The story of these plantations is not only one of torture and death, but also of survival and the unyielding human spirit. The punishments, diseases, and hunts were meant to reduce people to property, to extinguish individuality until only obedience remained. Overseers wielded the whip as both weapon and symbol, while hunger and exhaustion became silent overseers of their own. Quotas were impossible by design, punishments inevitable by intent. The entire system was calibrated to instill hopelessness. And yet, hopelessness never achieved total victory. For every scar left by the whip, for every family torn apart, there remained some ember of resistance, sometimes hidden, sometimes burning bright. Survival itself became resistance. To endure another sunrise, to pick another bowl of cotton, to sing quietly in the fields, was to deny the overseer complete triumph. William Wells Brown once wrote, "The cotton field is where souls are broken, where hope goes to die." But he also became proof that hope could survive. His escape, his words, and his activism transformed the memory of suffering into testimony that still echoes today. The memory of family, too, became a form of rebellion. Though owners used separation as punishment, enslaved people created kinship networks that transcended blood, adopting children of the lost, caring for the weak, keeping alive stories of ancestors. Even when mothers were forced to see children sold away, bonds of love and memory endured. Frederick Douglass described the cruelty of forced silence. The husband is not allowed to show emotion when his wife is sold from him. Yet even in silence, grief carried its own defiant truth, that love persisted in a world built to destroy it. Religion, though twisted by masters into a tool of control, was reclaimed in secret. While overseers forced biblical passages that justified obedience, enslaved people gathered in hidden hush harbors to sing, pray, and find meaning beyond their chains. The spirituals carried coded messages, but they also carried hope. Songs like "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot" or "Steal Away" were more than hymns. They were whispered promises that bondage would not last forever. As Harriet Tubman declared, "There are two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other." Her life embodied the truth that faith and freedom could walk hand in hand. Even small acts of defiance chipped away at the system's foundation. A broken tool, a slowed pace, a hidden message. Each act was a refusal. The very persistence of African traditions, languages, and healing practices was itself rebellion. Old Sarah's medicinal garden at Magnolia, the coded markings in Butler Island cabins, the quilt patterns stitched with secret maps, these acts preserved heritage, knowledge, and hope against all odds. They created a parallel culture of survival within the machinery of oppression. And then there were the boldest resistances, uprisings and escapes. Charles Deslandes' 1811 German Coast Rebellion, though crushed, terrified plantation owners. Robert Small's daring escape with a Confederate ship humiliated the slaveholding South and inspired countless others. Harriet Tubman, moving through shadows and swamps, led the enslaved to freedom and proved that even the most elaborate networks of control could be outwitted by courage. These stories are not outliers. They are reminders that resistance was as constant as oppression. The economic machine of cotton reduced lives to balance sheets, measuring flesh in pounds and profits. By 1860, Southern cotton exports topped $190 million annually, billions in today's value. But that wealth carried a hidden ledger of scars, graves, and stolen lives. It is easy to count bales of cotton, harder to count the screams, the broken families, the unmarked graves along the plantation roads, and yet, these too are part of the account, the debts history still owes. When emancipation came, it did not erase the shadows. The violence, trauma, and economic exploitation evolved into new forms: sharecropping, Jim Crow laws, prison labor camps like Angola. The tools changed, but the system of control persisted. Bloodhounds became police dogs, patrols became police forces. The continuity reminds us that history does not end neatly. It reverberates, reshaping itself into new chains. The echoes of those fields are still heard in inequalities and injustices today, and yet the spirit of those who endured also reverberates. Every testimony recorded by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s, every scar photographed by abolitionists, every word spoken by survivors like Solomon Northup or Harriet Jacobs, all of these remain as voices against forgetting. The museums that now display collars and whips do not hold mere artifacts. They hold the memory of lives that endured them. Historian David Blight captured it well. The sophistication of plantation punishment was not merely about controlling bodies. It was about breaking minds in ways that echo through generations. To remember is itself an act of justice. This story, drenched in suffering, is also drenched in resilience. The fact that songs were sung, prayers whispered, children raised, escapes attempted, and revolts dared proves that the human spirit is not so easily destroyed. The enslaved were not merely victims, they were survivors, rebels, healers, singers, and dreamers. Their dignity was not granted. It was asserted, often in silence, sometimes in blood, but always with unyielding defiance. And so, the fields where bodies bent under the relentless sun are also fields where resistance grew. Every cotton boll plucked by hands cut and bleeding, every song hummed beneath a whisper of danger, every dawn survived. All of it testifies to a truth stronger than chains: the human spirit endures. As Sojourner Truth declared in 1851, "Ain't I a woman? Look at my arm. I have ploughed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman?" Her words and the lives of countless others remind us that even in the darkest shadows, humanity shines. History demands we do not look away, for the story of cotton plantations is not simply the story of cruelty, but of courage, not just of suffering, but of survival. And in remembering, we ensure that the voices of those who lived and died in the fields are never silenced again.